There's a kind of music that exists before it becomes music, before it is arranged, produced, sequenced, given a title, pressed onto vinyl, and released into the hands of strangers who will decide what it means. There is the earlier version, the raw material, the unguarded moment, the sound that escapes before the artist has had time to consider whether it should. Most of that music disappears. It lives on damaged cassette tapes in cardboard boxes, on reels stored in studio archives, in the unreliable memories of the few people present when it was made. The world never hears it, and in most cases the artist intended it that way. But occasionally, that unguarded music surfaces. And when it does, it tells a different story than anything the artist chose to release. It tells the story of who they were when they thought no one was. Listening, in 1968, in a London flat that belonged to a woman who had just become the most controversial figure in John Lennon's life, a tape recorder was switched on. What followed was never supposed to exist as a public document. What followed was private, almost painfully so. And what followed, when it eventually reached the world, changed the way that world understood one of the most analyzed, celebrated, and mythologized artists of the 20th century. But to understand what happened in that flat in 1968, you have to understand what John Lennon was carrying into it. By 1968, John Lennon had been famous for 6 years in a way that very few people in history had been famous before. Not the ordinary fame of a successful musician, the kind that brings recognition in airports and money, and a certain insulation from ordinary difficulty. Something larger and stranger than that. The Beatles had become, by the mid-1960s, a cultural weather system. Their music had moved through the world with a velocity that dismantled the distinction between entertainment and event. People did not simply enjoy the Beatles. They organized their lives around them. They measured time by their albums. They heard things in the music that the musicians themselves had not entirely intended, and held those heard things as essential truth. John had watched this happen from the inside. He had watched his own image become a public object, something that existed independently of him, that could be praised and attacked and analyzed and merchandised without any reference to the actual person it was supposed to represent. He was sharp enough to find this funny sometimes, and honest enough to find it suffocating always. The press. Conferences that defined the early years of Beatlemania had given him a forum for the particular brand of wit that served as both expression and armor, fast, deflecting, occasionally savage, always performing the confidence that he had learned was necessary to survive the scrutiny. But the armor had weight, and beneath it things were accumulating. The mid-1960s had brought an artistic evolution that matched no one's expectations, including his own. The Beatles had moved from the direct emotional currency of their early work into territory that was stranger, more interior, more demanding of the listener, and more honestly reflective of what the people making the music were actually thinking and feeling. Albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver, and then SGT. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had shifted the terms of what popular music was allowed to be. John had been at the center of that shift, writing songs that went deeper into the private self than anything he had allowed himself before publicly. But public art, however honest, is still mediated. It goes through arrangement and production and the collaborative negotiation of 4 individuals who each have claims on the final sound. It goes through Brian Epstein's careful management of the band's public image, through the calculating consideration of what the world was ready to receive. Even at its most confessional, public art carries the residue of all the decisions made between the original impulse and the released version. It is never entirely raw. By 1967, John was searching for something rawer, something that did not have to survive the process. He met Yoko Ono in November 1966 at the Indica Gallery in London, where she was mounting a conceptual art exhibition. He had gone out of curiosity, the way he went to most things in that period, partly from genuine interest and partly from the restlessness of someone who has consumed everything available in one world and is looking, without quite knowing it, for entry into another. Yoko was unlike anyone he had encountered before. She was not impressed by him, or if she was, she gave no indication of it, which amounted to the same thing. She engaged with his mind directly, on the terms of ideas rather than celebrity, and the experience was disorienting enough that he kept returning to it. They began a correspondence, then a friendship, then something that neither of them could categorize cleanly. The relationship developed slowly and then all at once, the way things do when the conditions have been building for longer than the event itself. By early 1968, John and Yoko were spending increasing amounts of time together. Cynthia, John's wife, was largely absent from the picture, traveling, or at the couple's country home, while John remained in London, caught in the strange, suspended state of a marriage that was ending without yet having formally ended. The guilt he carried about this was real and complicated and sat alongside everything else he was carrying: the fame, the armor, the accumulated artistic pressure of being John Lennon in the year 1968. One night in May of 1968, while Cynthia was away, John invited Yoko to his home at Kenwood. What they did that night became one of the most storied moments in rock history, not because of what the world imagined, but because of what was actually recorded. They stayed up through the night making music, not the music John had been making with the Beatles. Structured, arranged, collaborative, intended for an audience, something different. They moved through John's home recording equipment freely, without agenda, making sounds that interested them and abandoning sounds that didn't, following impulse rather than form. They recorded voices and found noises and fragments of melody and stretches of ambient sound and things that didn't have names in any conventional musical vocabulary. They were not performing for anyone. They were simply playing in the oldest sense of the word, the sense that belongs to children before they learn that playing has to produce something justifiable. As dawn came, they listened back to what they had made. It was strange. It was ungainly in places and genuinely beautiful in others. It was, above everything else, completely honest, the sound of two people being entirely themselves in a room at 4 a.m. with no audience and no expectation. John listened to it with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he didn't yet fully understand but recognized as important. He had been making music for 15 years. He had made music that was technically accomplished and commercially successful and at its best, emotionally true. But he had not made anything quite like this. He had not made anything that felt this nakedly his own. The recordings were given a name, Two Virgins, not a conventional album title in any sense, a declaration, slightly aggressive, slightly vulnerable, completely uncompromising. The artwork John chose for the cover, a photograph of himself and Yoko, fully unclothed, facing the camera, made the declaration explicit. This was not a product, this was an exposure. When John announced his intention to release Two Virgins, the reaction from virtually everyone around him was immediate and uniform. Do not do this. EMI, the Beatles label, refused to distribute it. The other members of the Beatles were concerned not primarily about the music, but about what the release would mean for the band's image and their collective future. George Harrison was diplomatically uncomfortable. Paul McCartney was practically opposed. Ringo Starr said little and looked worried. Manager Neil Aspinall tried to find diplomatic language for what was essentially a plea to reconsider. John considered their concerns and released it anyway. The world's response was largely what everyone had predicted. Critics who had revered John Lennon as a songwriter found themselves confronting something they had no vocabulary for: not a song, not an album. Any recognizable sense, but an artifact of a specific relationship between two specific people on a specific night, released into the public sphere without any apparent concern for what the public sphere would make of it. Many found it self-indulgent, some found it incomprehensible. The cover photograph generated controversy that largely consumed the conversation about the music itself. But underneath all of that, beneath the controversy and the critical bafflement and the protective alarm of his bandmates, something else was happening, something that would take years to fully understand. John Lennon had released into the public record music that was never supposed to be public. He had taken the most private thing, a night alone with someone he loved, making sounds for no reason except that the sounds wanted to be made, and handed it outward. He had done it deliberately. He had done it knowing exactly what the response would be. And the question of why, when you look at it carefully, is more interesting than the controversy that surrounded the decision. He had spent 6 years inside a version of himself that the world had built around him. He had been John Lennon the Beatle, a role that was real but also constructed, that represented him but also contained him. Two Virgins was not a statement about art. It was a statement about personhood. It was John Lennon saying, in the most direct way available to him, "Here is what I sound like when there is no one watching. Here is the music that exists before it becomes music. Here is the self that lives underneath the public self." It cost him something to do this. Publicly and privately, the release of Two Virgins accelerated tensions within the Beatles that were already considerable. The relationship with Paul, with George, with the institutional apparatus of the band, all of it became more complicated. The world that had loved John Lennon the Beatle was not prepared to love John Lennon the person, unfiltered and unmediated, standing naked on an album cover with a woman who was not his wife. But John had always been more interested in truth than in comfort. This was not a new quality. It was the quality that had made his best songs the things they were, that particular combination of vulnerability and fearlessness that allowed him to say things in public that most people barely allowed themselves to think in private. Two Virgins was that quality at its most extreme, stripped of melody, stripped of the conventional structures that made his other work accessible, stripped of everything except the raw fact of two people being present together in a room. It was more honest than anything he had ever made, and more costly, and in its own particular way, more important. The years that followed Two Virgins moved fast and turbulently. The Beatles dissolved in 1970. The cumulative weight of artistic divergence and personal tension, and the loss of Brian Epstein, who had died in 1967, finally pulling the band apart in ways that no single event could be blamed for, but that all involved would spend years trying to explain. John moved through the dissolution into solo work that was, in some respects, a continuation of what Two Virgins had begun, a commitment to honesty over polish, to the raw interior truth over the managed public presentation. The Plastic Ono Band album, released in December 1970, was the most direct expression of this, recorded using the primal therapy techniques John had been exploring with therapist Arthur Janov. It was sparse and sometimes harrowing, the sound of someone excavating the foundation of their own life and reporting what they found without aesthetic softening. Songs about his mother, songs about the abandonment by his father Alfred, songs about the machinery of fame and the particular loneliness it produced. John sang them with a directness that had no precedent in his earlier work, a voice stripped of everything except the thing being said. Critics who had been baffled by Two Virgins understood Plastic Ono Band more easily because it was structured as music rather than as sound. But the impulse was the same, the impulse that had been fully present on that night in 1968, when John and Yoko had switched on a tape recorder with no audience and no plan, and simply made the sounds that needed to be made. He had learned something that night that would stay with him, that the most honest version of himself was the one that appeared when the performance requirements were removed. That the music which existed before it became music, before it was arranged for an audience and an industry and a history that was already being written around him, was the music that most clearly sounded like who he actually was. In 1980, settled in New York with Yoko and their son Sean, John gave a series of interviews that were widely noted for their reflective quality. He had spent 5 years largely withdrawn from public life, years of domesticity, of being present for his son in ways his own father had never been for him, of allowing the silence to accumulate rather than filling it with production. He spoke in those interviews about the creative life with a directness that surprised some of the journalists present, who had expected the famous wit and deflection and instead received something quieter and more considered. He spoke about the difference between making music for the world and making music for yourself. He spoke about the recordings he had made over the years that had never been intended for release, the private experiments, the late-night cassettes, the sounds that existed only because the moment had demanded them. He spoke about Two Virgins not with defensiveness, but with a kind of settled understanding, the understanding of someone who has lived long enough with a decision to see what it actually was. It was the most honest thing I've ever done, he said. Not the best, not the most musical, the most honest. He was 40 years old. He had been making music since he was a teenager in Liverpool. He had made music that would outlast every other artifact of its era. And the thing he was most at peace with, looking back from 1980, was the night he had switched on a tape recorder in a London flat and made something that was never supposed to leave the room. Because in leaving the room, in insisting on leaving the room against all advice and all reasonable prediction of consequence, it had become something more than a private document. It had become proof that the unguarded self was real. That the music underneath the music existed, that it was possible, even for someone as mythologized and managed and publicly owned as John Lennon had become, to simply be a person making sounds in the dark. He was shot and killed on December 8, 1980, outside his home at the Dakota Building in New York City. The interviews he had given that year remained, the last extended. Record of his thinking, his voice, his settled and still curious and still restless self. The music he had made across 3 decades remained, both the music the world had received and the music that had begun on that night in 1968 before any of it was music, when it was only two people in a room and a tape recorder and the sound of honesty before it knew it had an audience. That sound, unguarded, unpolished, unglamorous, was where everything had always started. It was where everything true always starts.